if you could address that secret of success, both referring to generally what and why sapiens are so different than other animals, and if you could also relate to the difference in scale that Yuval mentioned, the difference between 10 chimpanzees and 1,000. So please.
To begin with a disclaimer that is honest, neither of us knows the secret of success for sapiens, but both of us are interested in this question and are willing to speculate. So I will offer my speculation. There are some things that contributed, although I think that were not decisive, and that one can infer from the fossil record. It is clear from the fossil record that human brains expanded greatly to be about 4 times the size of chimpanzee brains, and that permitted some things already in the fossil record hundreds of thousands of years ago. There was some interesting stuff like spears and some evidence for acting. That's to say, detachment of tools. So large brains are part of the picture, but there were large brains long before anything got interesting 7,000 years ago. Another part of the picture, Richard Wrangham, recently working together with a former student of mine, Stephen Secor, has pointed out that control of fire, brings significant nutritional advantages. With fire, you can extract about 20% more calories from food. And Richard and my student, Stephen Secor, demonstrated this in an interesting way because Stephen in my laboratory did projects on pythons, big snakes in which he could measure their digestive efficiency. And so Stephen fed pythons cooked chickens and uncooked chickens. It turns out that the cooked chicken used 20% more calories. And so when humans began to control fire, which maybe was more than 1 million years ago, and there's evidence for serious control, perhaps a couple 100,000 years ago, that gives us 20% more calories, which is significant, but it's not yet letting us cooperate 1,000 at a time. Tools are significant. Yes, the spears of a couple of 100,000 years ago are significant. And now, of course, we have potent tools like microphones. But the real question is, why did lots of interesting stuff appear within the last 70,000 years, including the ability to spread an idea among 1,000 people? The only candidate that seems to me plausible is the development of complex human language. Chimpanzees do not have complex language. Vervet monkeys have a sort of language, a simple proto-language, with different grunts that mean leopard, eagle, or python. But it's a tiny vocabulary and there's not grammar. Chimpanzees grunt, but nobody has established vocabulary, and certainly not grammar for chimpanzees. Once one has language, though, one can do lots of things. One can motivate 1,000 people. Without language, you can't motivate 1,000 people. But with language, you can do other things. You can devise complex tools like microphones or sickles for wheat 11,000 years ago. So it seems to me that a decisive step must have been the development of modern human language. Why don't chimpanzees have language? Well, one can study the anatomy of the chimpanzee vocal tract. There are baby chimpanzees that have been brought up in the home of human psychologists, and the psychologists watch the chimpanzees develop babbling while human babies develop babbling. And the chimp never gets beyond the equivalent of a maybe 1-year-old human, because the anatomy of the chimpanzee vocal tract does not permit chimpanzees to distinguish vowels and to distinguish many of the consonants. In short, it seems to me that an anatomical change in this very complex mechanism, so my watch, if this were a Swiss watch, would have very complicated insides, and if those insides aren't there, it doesn't tell time. Well, our vocal tract is very complicated, if those complicated insides aren't there, then one can't speak. So my guess would be that the small change that permitted all the interesting stuff, including influencing 1,000 other humans within the last 70,000 years, would have been a small change in the anatomy of the vocal tract that let us distinguish many different vowels and many different consonants, hence complex language, hence grammar, hence the ability to convince each other of the rightness of ideas, hence the ability to convince 1,000 people to do other things, hence the ability to invent microphones and the ability to write B-minor mass and invent atomic lines. So I see the decisive step speculatively as anatomical changes that permitted complex union.
Yes, first of all, it's really important to what Professor Diamond said at first, that many of these answers are really speculations, with more or less evidence, but nobody really knows the final answer. And I think that most scholars would agree, however, about the immense importance of language as being of unique language, because other animals too have language, but not the unique kind of language that sapiens has. And about language, again, I would emphasize, for me, the most amazing thing about sapiens language is the ability to speak about things that don't exist, which necessitates not just the vocal ability, because parrots can say everything that the Pope can say, and still it won't help, because they say it, but they don't know, they don't believe it. But the Pope, on the other hand, he does believe what he says, and millions of others believe what he says. And this is, for me, from an evolutionary perspective, this is amazing, because you would have thought that if somebody goes to the forest, then looking for angels and fairies and trolls and things like that, it would be an evolutionary disadvantage, because you're wasting precious time. You should be allocating to searching for mushrooms, searching for fairies, which are not there. And nevertheless, this counterintuitive ability is one, not the only, but one of the most decisive advantages that Homo sapiens have over all the rest. You could, as a speculative, the thought experiments, imagine a sapiens that can say everything we say, but must stick to things that really exist. Now try to imagine how to construct a complex society. Very, very, very difficult.
So let's add into that equation one more aspect. You're talking about language, you're talking about imagination, but even language and imagination hasn't kept us in the same kind of tent that we built to have some sort of house, and hasn't kept us within the same realm of the foods that we either gather or hunt or even grow. So we constantly, as a species, search to develop and to change. Could you relate to that? The only species.
I could relate to it based on my experience with New Guineans over the last 50 years. And this goes back to a question that someone raised about actions that have unforeseeable consequences. The New Guineans with whom I've been working for the last 50 years, they're curious people. They're always trying things. When I brought number 2 yellow pencils to New Guinea in 1964, and I gave away some of my pencils. So what are these New Guineans going to do with pencils? Well, these New Guineans who didn't write, here is this object, and so they experiment with it. And one New Guinean who had a pierced earlobe figured this bright yellow pencil is a good decoration for his earlobe. That's an unexpected consequence. New Guineans are always testing local plants and animals. When the New Guineans that work with me, I take to another area, they're talking with the local people. What animal do you have? What animal do you have? What do you do with this? They're gathering plants. They hear that this plant is this country. So they're bringing back plants with them. And New Guineans, in short, they're constantly trying things. Most of this is not goal-directed. Most of this is just trying something, and occasionally it stumbles on something. For example, 5,000 BC, nobody set out with the goal of smelting copper, but copper got smelted from 5,000 BC onwards. And we inferred that it arose as a result of people playing with clays and with stones, and there were fires, and the stones either were put into fires in order to break them and make tools, and there were different stones. I'm going to tell you one more story, even though this will take take time. So New Guineans know a lot about different stones and the usefulness of stones. Eventually they stumbled on copper. But I want to tell you one more story because it's such a delicious story. In working on New Guinea, because I work on birds, I'm always asking New Guineans about the names for birds in their local language. They don't have Latin names, they don't have English names. In every local language there are names for birds like Isawanataba and Masila and Masula, and so I spend many days with every New Guinea tribe that I work with trying to find out what are the names for birds in the local language. Okay, a friend of mine, an anthropologist who knew birds very well, worked for decades with the New Guinea tribe, and he got the names of local birds and he got the names of local animals from them. And then he thought he would ask people about the names for local stones and the use they got from stones. So he asked people, and rather quickly people told him, we have only one word for stone, and it's a word that it covers all stones. And this seemed unlikely to him, that they wouldn't differentiate among stones because after all people like copper and stuff, and they have stones for stone tools, but they insisted we have just one word for stone. But that's what they insisted. And then my friend came back on a subsequent trip to bring me with him a geologist. And the geologist began talking to people, and within 10 minutes, the geologist brought back to my friend a list of 50 different names for 50 different stones, at which point my friend got angry. He was terribly embarrassed and said, I've been asking you people, and you said that there was only one word for stone, and now I bring in my friend, and I'm embarrassed in front of him. He turns out to be 50 names. Why didn't you tell me that? And they explained, we didn't tell you that because with birds, we talked with you about birds, and we saw you knew a lot about birds, and you were talking about birds. But once you started asking us about stones, it was clear that you didn't know anything about stones. We raced our time telling you things that couldn't understand.
Thank you.
Basically, I agree. I mean, humans have an amazing ability, an amazing drive to search and invent more and more things. And the most crucial thing is that most of the time, they don't really know what's going to come out of it. They plan very short term. They're like the sorcerer's apprentice in the legend. They know how to release a magic spell that changes everything, but they have absolutely no idea where it's going to take them, and they can't really direct it or stop it once it's out of their control.
So that brings me to our neighborhood. Professor Diamond, you mentioned before that that Israel and the crescent here, the Fertile Crescent, played such an overwhelming role in the development of human history. Could you explain what enabled this area to play that role and how it spread out in certain areas and not in others? And then maybe Yuval can relate to that as well.
I'll give an answer in terms of proximate and ultimate cause, and both of us talk about immediate causes and then more distant causes. For example, one might say that the ability to convince 1,000 humans is a proximate cause, but where did that ability come from? Or maybe an ultimate cause is the vocal traffic. So what is it about the environment of the Fertile Crescent that led it to play such an important role in human history? Approximate cause, the fact is that the Fertile Crescent is home to the greatest variety of the most productive, potentially domesticable wild plant and animal species in the world, and that is a fact. Wild wheat, barley, cow, sheep, goat, pigs, and horses. That you can call approximate cause. But then there's an ultimate explanation. That is a fact of biogeography. But why is it that the Fertile Crescent ended up as home to the greatest variety of productive wild plant and animal species? And the ultimate explanation is that the Fertile Crescent is part of what's called the Mediterranean zone, with Mediterranean climate, which, as you know, is hot, dry summers and cool, moist winters. There are 4 other Mediterranean zones around the world: Southern California, Chile, Southwest Australia, Southern Africa. Of the Mediterranean zones select for big seeds, which are useful for us humans. They select for annual plants, cereals and grasses, with big seeds, because the big seeds then are able to survive the long, hot summer when the rest of the plant dies back, and in the fall, when the rains come, the plant with the bigger seeds grows up quickly. So Mediterranean zones are good for human potential for agriculture. that then raises the question, though, why is it your Mediterranean zone and not our Southern California Mediterranean zone that had the largest number of useful species? And I think the answer to that is reasonably clear, that your Mediterranean zone is by far the largest Mediterranean zone in the world. It extends from the Straits of Gibraltar into Iran. It has a great range of elevations up to over 5,000 meters in the Caucasus. It is the most extreme Mediterranean zone with the greatest climatic variation through the year. And that size and that range of elevations selected for the largest number of plant and animal species in your Mediterranean zone, but also selected to the most extreme degree for plants that produce big seeds that will last through the summer. So I would say that's the ultimate reason. The immediate reason for first agriculture are the facts of biogeography. And the ultimate reason for those facts of biogeography is that you've got the largest and the highest and the most variable Mediterranean zone.
And I would like to add what is really fascinating about the history of the Middle East, or the place of the Middle East in history. It's not just that agriculture started there, but it is the continuing importance of the Middle East. Because one could have imagined that, okay, the first and best agricultural package appeared in the Middle East because of the reasons that Professor Diamond elaborated. But after it appeared, it could have migrated, either with the people or without them, to other places, or maybe further away in the Mediterranean zone, westwards, or to other places, and the Middle East would lose its initial importance or dominance. And we don't see it happening. Even 10,000 years after the beginning of the agricultural revolution, we still have, for example, two of the most important ideological movements, Christianity and Islam, springing from the same place and taking over much of the world, except for certain parts of East and Southeast Asia. And what explains this continuing importance, I think the other major factor is also geographical. It's simply that it's in the middle. And it's therefore a transition zone between many different other areas, and can be influenced, can amalgamate more ideas, more technology, and can influence more easily other zones. But this eventually, with the advance of technology, and in the modern age, the Middle East lost this geographical predominance with the invention of more and better transportation abilities, which basically meant that any place on the world could now be the middle, not just the Middle East. So it still retains some importance due to past, to attachment to past stories, the Holy Land and so forth, and it has oil. But apart from that, it is being now pushed more and more to the side.
Okay, so that brings us to today. Since you're speaking of already globalization, and the question arises, where are we going? You both addressed this question from different perspectives. If we look at the collapses that you, Professor Diamond, referred to, the Maya and Angkor, in this day and age of globalization, you would speak of the resources that we are exploiting would actually have a global effect instead of a specific effect in a certain geographic setting. That's one way that we could look at where we're going if we look on the outside, the environment. But also there's an inside environment, and there's a change there that humans are inflicting on themselves. And you say, Yuval, that we're actually coming to the point where humans are going to change their own species. And that is where we're going. So if you could elaborate a bit on those two different traits that we might be taking before we make the decision where we're actually going to go, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Where are we going today? Since that's a large question, let me focus on the first of your two questions. And again, an honest answer to that. Anybody would say, we don't know where we're going today because there's a range of options. We could be going somewhere very bad, extremely bad. We could be going somewhere good. If we go somewhere good, we know what that somewhere good is going to have to consist of. Somewhere good can only be a world in which human use of resources is sustainable, number one. And number two, a world in which differences in consumption rate around the world are modest, so that people will not have incentive either to emigrate or to carry out terrorist acts. So if there's a good solution, it seems to me it can be only that sort of good solution. A bad solution in the very worst case would be a nuclear solution in which there ends up not being a human species. A milder bad solution would be ones in which the conditions for advanced civilization no longer exist. And here you suggested a possible outcome that if there were only a few people left, those people will be rich superhumans. I'd like to suggest an alternative outcome, which is that if there is a worldwide catastrophe that removes the basis for advanced civilization as we know it, then the few people who will be left will not be rich superhumans, but they will be my New Guinea friends, because the reality is that our civilization is based on resources of which we've already stripped off the earth the most easily accessible resources. We've already mined the most accessible copper, the most accessible tin, we've already extracted the most accessible oil, and therefore if we should destroy civilization, we're not going to be able to go back to 1880, get oil scraped from the surface in the Pennsylvania oil fields. We won't be able to rebuild a petroleum-based civilization or metal-based civilization. Who are the people who know how to operate without oil and petroleum? Well, my New Guinea friends were doing it very recently. I have friends in New Guinea who were on the last trips to the stone quarries in the 1970s. They know how to make stone tools. They've been practicing agriculture for 7,000 years. They've been lighting fires without matches. My guess is that none of us here would be competent at making really good stone tools and would be competent at lighting a fire without matches, and therefore, in my bad case scenario of removing the conditions for a first world civilization, I see the few survivors as being people like my New Guinea friends.
You're talking about a different kind of change in the human race.
Yes, I think that the really big question mark, which makes it very, very difficult to predict anything in terms of even decades, not to mention centuries, is that throughout history, there have been always one big constant, which was Homo sapiens itself. The technology changed, the economy changed, society changed, politics changed, ideas changed, but it was basically the same Homo sapiens. If you go back to biblical times, or if you go back to the agricultural revolution, it's still basically the same people as you and me, in terms of how they think and feel and behave. And the really big revolution, which might be just waiting around the corner, there will still be technological and economic and political revolutions in the 21st century, but the really big revolution is that the single constant factor of history, which is Homo sapiens itself, this will be undergoing a revolution with such things as bioengineering, genetic engineering, direct brain-computer interfaces, and so forth. And if this really takes off and begins to change Homo sapiens, then we have absolutely no way of even beginning to imagine what the new species, what the new creatures will be like, what would be their abilities, their desires, their emotional life, and so forth. And this is a kind of a screen which we can see ourselves approaching, but we can't see anything beyond it. I mean, per definition, if what we are talking about is changing the most basic qualities, cognitive and emotional qualities of Homo sapiens, then with our present day cognitive and emotional abilities, we can't see what's happening behind that screen. And the point that the screen falls is often called today the singularity. There's various meanings this word, but this is the point beyond which our abilities to understand simply fall apart. It's like trying to explain to Neanderthals how human society functions in the modern age. I mean, it's basically impossible. I mean, they can understand what a table is, but they can't understand capitalism, or they can't understand the way that humans really feel and behave.
We already see some small changes like that. Can you give an example? In basic human properties?
The changes are all around us. I mean, it's that now more and more psychiatric drugs, which are used to change. I mean, this is nothing really happens in one day. There is always an accumulation of small steps. And suddenly you look back and realize something amazing has happened. So we see it more and more with the easiest way to change Homo sapiens with psychiatric drugs. But then again, behind the corner, there is a possibility of genetic engineering. We are doing amazing things or terrible things, but it depends how you look at it, to other creatures like worms and mice and so forth. There is no technical reason why we can't do the same to sapiens. There are moral reasons and political reasons, but once the incentive is high enough, the moral reasons and the political reasons won't be strong enough to withstand it. And we are now working at a furious rate on solving the brain-computer interface problem, how to create a direct interface between the mind and the computer so that you can communicate directly, not with eyes and fingers, but communicate directly from human consciousness to a computer and vice versa, which also, if they solve it, it also means that several humans connected to the same computer can be connected consciousness to consciousness directly. Nobody has any clue about what will happen to human identity and to human society if they solve the brain-computer interface problem. Some people say it's impossible, but many people believe it is certainly possible. Just, I think, 2 or 3 months ago, the European Union gave 1 billion euros to the Blue Brain Project. And if the Blue Brain Project is successful, one of the things it means is that they will solve the brain-computer interface problem. Now, again, many people say it won't happen, it's a waste of money. But if the European Union, at this stage of economic crisis, nevertheless gives somebody 1 billion euro, it means that there is serious thinking behind it.
So you want to say something?
I would like to mention a more modest example of something that lies in front of the screen rather than behind the screen. This is not to deny what might lie behind the screen, but there are things that are happening now in front of the screen where we can observe them, and there are big changes in how humans interact. Those are the changes associated with the means of communication that have come in the last several decades, which are no longer face-to-face communication. In New Guinea, when I work in New Guinea, I am struck by the vividness of communication in New Guinea, that when I talk to New Guinea, it's face-to-face, I have full attention, they're talking all day long because there's no other entertainment, there's no television, there are no movies, they're not looking down to check their cell phones or to send an email or a text message, but it is full attention, face-to-face communication. And the result is that New Guineans are socially highly skilled people. I remember an incident when one of the major international oil companies wanted to negotiate oil leases on land owned by New Guineans, and the New Guineans were villagers who had never been out of New Guinea, and so the MBAs and the international lawyers went out to negotiate with New Guineans, expecting that they would just run all over the New Guineans and be able to out-bargain them. And in fact, what happened is that the New Guineans, these villagers, had a far wider range of negotiating skills than did the MBAs. They would lie without hesitation. They would change their demands. Different ones would make different pictures. The next morning, after having reached the agreement the previous day, they would say, no, that was yesterday. They drove the MBAs crazy, and in the end, the socially skilled individuals got what they wanted and the oil. So here's the example. What is the consequence of the loss within the last several decades of face-to-face communication and the increasing reliance on indirect communication? First of all, with the telephone, which has been around for a century, and now with email, which has been around for several decades, and now with text messaging. So when I watch my sons of their generation, it is not full attention communication. When my sons come over for dinner, and yes, they're looking up at us, and then they're looking down and doing their text messaging. Well, if you're not giving someone your full attention, you're missing the social cues, you are missing the acquisition of social skills, you're not understanding people as well. Where does this lead? My wife has Japanese cousins, And so we hear a good deal about life in Japan. In Japan, this transition to indirect communication has been particularly marked because 50 years ago, most marriages in Japan were arranged. And Japan has moved away from arranged marriages, moved to the Western custom of couples negotiating, dating and negotiating marriages themselves, at the same time as the electronic media have taken over in Japan. And it means that modern young Japanese are no longer having their marriages arranged for them. They're having to arrange their own marriages at a time when for decades they have not developed the social skills to do this. And so our Japanese cousin told us the sad story of being in a restaurant and seeing a couple, a young man and a young woman, sitting there looking awkwardly, and they were obviously there on their first date, but they weren't talking to each other. They each had their cell phones and they were text messaging to each other because they were just so shy and so socially unskilled that they could not talk to each other face to face.
So, we have still time. First of all, would you like to ask each other a question? You can think about it in a few minutes, but first we'll let the audience... we have 15 minutes for questions, and I know that there are many, many questions. I see all the hands. Please keep your questions very short and brief so that we can get to all of you. I'm going to start over there.
I have a question that can come to the two of you. My interest is in the agriculture of the cultures of ancient India and ancient China. And the specific question about them is because of the elaborate way of science and philosophical understanding of the world and of the human being. I tried to find information about the ways of agriculture, like the ways of medicine, but I could not find. So first of all, I would like to know, is there an elaborate way of agriculture that is equivalent to the natural understanding of the human? And then to continue to Yuval, the question is, can you see a connection between the spiritual understanding and your idea of imagination? Because I see quite a big equivalence between them.
That's keeping the question short.
I can make a brief comment on that. Yes, we know a great deal. We know a great deal about the development of agriculture and the forms of agriculture in China. Somewhat less in India, but we're learning in India. As for sources to read about it, two book sources that will summarize it conveniently for you will be Peter Bellwood's book, The First Farmers, published I think in 2005 in My Guns, Germs, and Steel, published in 1997. A significant advance is that we've known for a long time that China was one of the first centers of agriculture. We have a long list of the domesticates accomplished in China. Rice in southern China, 2 species of millets in northern China, pigs independently of Fertile Crescent, chickens, water buffalo. What has been learned in the last half dozen years is that India, which at the time that I wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, did not rank as a center of independent domestication. There's now evidence that India was at least a secondary, a milder, less important center of independent domestication. And a starting point for this is that I think the Journal of Archaeological Science, or Archaeological Reviews, an archaeological journal, has a series of about 250 pages of articles on the rise of agriculture from a year or so ago, with an article on early agriculture in India. And to sum it up, there is evidence for independent domestication in India of eggplants and sesame and indigo, and then cattle were independently domesticated in India. The Zebu cattle, yes, cattle were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, but there was also an independent domestication of cattle in India. So in short, this is an area where we do have information.
And try to answer very short, very briefly, that yes, there are parallels between my historic understanding and some of the spiritual ideas that you mentioned. For those who know that there is a very central spiritual idea about the world being Maya, the world of illusion. And it is a nice way of, I think, summarizing the main points that I was trying to make, that yes, we are living in Maya, in the world of illusion. Illusion not in the sense that it's a lie, illusion not in the sense that it doesn't happen, illusion in the sense that we are living in a world which is governed by things that exist only in our own imagination, but they are still extremely powerful, and they are the things that move and control our lives.
Could you please speak shortly about your research methodology and the difference between the classical methodology and the way you work and it's gaining more popularity?
The research, you want them to discuss the methodologies that they use in their research.
Okay, again, try to do it very brief. The really big problem in answering big questions is that you usually cannot use the accepted methodologies of scientific research because you can't really know what you're talking about much of the time. I mean, the expectation is that if I write about, say, Neanderthals, then I've researched extensively Neanderthals, I've been to excavations, I know all the latest finds, understand how to do carbon-14 dating and so forth and so on. If I write something about China, then I need to know Chinese and to read the sources in the original Chinese and so forth, and that obviously can't be done. So when you're writing popular science, you must violate the most basic rules of the academic games. It is very, very dangerous, especially in terms of how your colleagues might react. Then I think that the key point in order to do it well is to preserve a kernel of truth that you manage to pass on to the audience, to the readers, and then it balances all your sins and all your misdeeds.
Yeah, I would make 3 brief points. One, responding to your comment about popular science. Yes, writing science for the broad public requires writing in a style that the broad public can understand, not writing in the style that the 4 experts in sodium transport and gallbladder, whom I addressed my first papers, can understand. So it requires a different style. But in academia, we are trained, we are socialized into writing in a highly technical, incomprehensible style. And so when the 2 of us then write in a style that appeals to the broad public, then other scientists react to us like someone who is, like a man who has a beautiful sister and who has been told for 30 years, don't commit incest with your sister. And then along comes someone who does commit incest with his beautiful sister. You are utterly outraged because he's doing what you want to do. The 2 of us are doing what other academics want to do, what the whole time do. That's one thing. So, second thing I would mention as regards methodology is that in what we do, we cannot perform manipulative laboratory experiments. We can't figure out whether humans can convince 1,000 other humans by dividing you into a group on the left and a group on the right, and we'll inject you here with some DNA, and we'll inject you here with a saline control, and in 20 years we'll find out whether the DNA really did let you convince 1,000 other humans. Instead, we have to resort to natural experiments. So the essence in history is that it's not a manipulative, it's not a field in which you can practice the manipulative experiments that chemists and molecular biologists adhere to, but it's a field that requires natural experiments, but that's also true of astronomy and historical geology and ecology. And then the last thing, the most personal thing about the methods that we use, certainly the method that I use, and I wouldn't be surprised if you use similar methods, is that just as you started out not being an expert in Neanderthals in China, I was not an expert in the wild plant and animal species of the Near East. And so my method is to find out who are the experts and talk to them and come visit them and read their papers. And if I'm writing about Greenland, go visit Greenland. In the case of domestication of plants in the Middle East, the expert on the subject is a great Israeli botanist called Daniel Harari. And on my previous visit to Israel in 1994, I had the privilege of spending hours talking with Danny Zohari, who was very generous of his time. He was glad to meet someone who shared his interest and explained to me in detail many things that I've never heard explained so clearly by anyone else. Harari explained to me in detail why oak trees have not been domesticated and why old world agriculture is more productive than new world agriculture. So methods then consist of finding out who does know about who is the expert, talking with the expert, reading papers, and possibly going to the place and seeing things.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for the sister analogy.
You have a beautiful sister, I see. Good.
I learned from you a lot about the development of different nations. And I would like to know how would you treat the question of different cultural traits of nations. And then the English are very different. They say that different mentalities from the French and the Italian are laid back. They say that in the Middle East everybody's crazy. And in respect to Professor Diamond's work, would you also link that to geographical consequences?
A simple answer would be that
The
one of
microphone, please.
simple answer is that one of the central questions of anthropology and sociology is the question that you raised. That is to say, to what extent is culture predictable from environmental circumstances, and to what extent is culture an independent variable? There's no doubt that some culture is environmentally predictable. People wear clothes north of the Arctic Circle, and they wear few or no clothes on the equator. That's a cultural trait that has clear environmental explanations. A more subtle example is that Aboriginal Australians did not become farmers, not because of anything about Aboriginal Australian culture, but because Australia does not have domesticable wild plant and animal species the way the Fertile Crescent does. But it's also clear that much culture is independent of the environment. The fact that the French eat frogs and horses and snails, whereas the British do not eat frogs and horses and snails, does not have an environmental explanation, because there are frogs, horses, and snails in both Britain and in France. This is a cultural variable that cannot be explained on environmental grounds.
Yes, I mean, basically there are some traits like that and some traits like that. I think in the long run, most of the more interesting traits which we ask about are those which are not obviously affected by the environment. I mean, the more interesting questions about culture usually relate to those aspects of culture which are not deterministically determined by the environmental factors. And another point is that you can see along history that in exactly the same environment, very different cultures emerge, or one culture changes into another and so forth, without any obvious environmental change. So in those cases, it's very hard to say that the environment shaped the culture. Say, many people associate in Greece as the origin of democracy. But there was just one time in Greece, and they tried to find an environmental explanation about something about the Greek shorelines and something about the Greek climate that was conducive to democracy. But Greek shorelines and the Greek geography and Greek climate did not change very much afterwards. And after about 200 years, in which in some parts of Greece, democracy in the shape of those days flourished, it disappeared. And ever since then, until the last few decades, there was no democracy in Greece. On the other hand, it was one of the central areas of huge despotic empires. So if there was anything democratic about the climate or the geography, how to explain that it produced democracies just in several places for 200 years and not afterwards?
Thank you.
According to your theory, religions, just like the capitalism, communism, or human rights, is just an imaginary structures. And what I'm really curious to know is if you believe that these particular structures have any possibility of ever disappearing from the human society. And the reason I'm asking is because both your theories give great answers to the question of how, but not to the question of why. When I say why, I mean in the Monty Python deepest sense. Why are we here in the past life of the past?
eager to say something.
Let me be a model of the short answer, the one-sentence answer, and I'll also be the model of the shameless author promoting his own book. In my most recent book, The World Until Yesterday, there is a long chapter on the evolution of religion, which concludes with a page speculating on the future of religion. And as a shameless author, rather than answer your question here, I recommend it to you
The way I understand religion in such a way that capitalism I also consider as a religion, and communism and feminism, they are also religions. And if you accept this interpretation of religion, which you don't have to, but if you accept this interpretation, then I don't think that Homo sapiens, or at least sapient societies, can exist without some kind of religion, because this is the basis for the social structure. If we become superhumans, something completely different, then who knows? But as long as there are sapiens, as we have known them for the last thousands of years, they will also be religions. And as for the why, so this is the question that was, I think, abolished from the lexicon maybe 100 years ago or more. There is no why to human history or to evolution. You see the process and you explain how it happens and how it develops. But the idea that there is some goal, some aim, some purpose, so I think this is the one of the most basic insights of evolutionary thinking, which have influenced history as much as biology, is that you can explain very, very complex processes without there being a why.
Well, we have time for one last question. I'm sorry. Yeah. You're the winner.
It seems if I try to put everything in one big, very generative generalization, as a race, as a species, we're racing forward. I fear that aimlessly sometimes, and we're always trying to enumerate ourselves and expand. And are there any precedents or insights in history or anywhere in human culture that we have learned to slow down or to maybe maintain progress but still take it in a more moderate pace and not exhaust everything around us?
Yes, there are lots of examples. There are societies that messed up by roaring ahead and overexploiting their resources and collapsing as a result. And there are also societies that figured out how to manage their resources and carry on sustainably for a long time. Examples of the latter are Japan, which has been going on without a major environmental collapse for at least 15,000 years. In particular, Japan of the 1600s and 1700s saw